A man kneels on a wooden floor. His sword rests beside him, not in his hand. In a few moments, he will end his own life calmly, deliberately, without a single tear. And the strangest part isn't that he's willing to die. It's that he sees this moment as the greatest victory of his life. To understand that, you have to understand something most people get completely wrong about the samurai. We think of them as warriors, fighters, men who lived for the sword. But the sword was never the point. The real weapon the samurai carried, the one that built an empire, terrified enemies, and still shapes how millions of people think today, was a way of thinking. A mindset engineered over centuries to override one of the strongest instincts a human being has, the fear of death. So the question isn't how the samurai fought. It's how a warrior class convinced itself, generation after generation, that dying correctly mattered more than living safely. And once you understand the psychology behind that idea, you start to see it everywhere in how people today chase discipline, how they define honor, and why some of the most successful people you know operate with a strange, almost unsettling calm under pressure. This is the story of how that mindset was built, and why, centuries later, we still can't stop studying it. Japan, before the samurai existed as a defined class, was not a peaceful place. Around the 9th century, the imperial court in Kyoto controlled the nation on paper, but out in the provinces, land disputes, tax collection, and local power struggles created constant low-level violence. The court needed men who could enforce order without the emperor personally intervening. Those men were called bushi, warriors, and over the following centuries they evolved from hired enforcers into a hereditary military class with its own land, its own loyalties, and eventually its own government. By the 12th century, that shift became official. In 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo established the Kamakura Shogunate, a military government that ran the country in the emperor's name while actually holding the real power. For the first time in Japanese history, warriors, not aristocrats, not priests, not the imperial court, sat at the top of society. That single change created a problem nobody had solved before. If the people with the most power are also the people trained to kill, what stops the entire system from collapsing into chaos? The answer historians point to is psychological, not just political. A code began to form, unwritten at first, passed down through practice and example, that gave warriors a reason to restrain their own power. Loyalty to a lord, discipline over impulse, a deep, almost obsessive concern with how one's actions would be judged, not by the law, but by one's own conscience and community. This is the seed of what would later be called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Here's where most documentaries get it wrong, and where the real psychology gets interesting. Bushido was not a single fixed rulebook handed down from ancient times. It evolved unevenly across regions and centuries, and much of what people today think of as the ancient samurai code was actually formalized much later, during a long period of peace. That matters, because it tells us something important about human behavior. Codes of honor are often built not during war, but during the anxious quiet after it, when a warrior class has to justify its own existence in a world that no longer needs warriors. That moment arrived in 1603, when Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan and began over 250 years of relative peace known as the Edo period. And this is where the deepest psychological transformation happened. Suddenly, an entire class of men trained from childhood for combat had almost no combat left to fight. Their skills were obsolete. Their purpose was in question. So the samurai class did something remarkable. Instead of fading away, they turned their warrior identity inward. If they couldn't prove themselves on the battlefield, they would prove themselves through discipline, self-control, and moral conduct in everyday life. This is a pattern behavioral scientists recognize far beyond feudal Japan. When a group's original function disappears, the group doesn't usually vanish. It rewrites its own meaning to survive. The samurai reframed the entire purpose of being a warrior. Physical combat became secondary. Character became everything. It was during this peaceful era that some of the most influential samurai texts were actually written. The Hagakure, compiled in the early 18th century from the teachings of a former samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo, is one of the most famous. It contains a line that has been translated and repeated for centuries. The idea that a warrior should live with the constant awareness of death, treating every day as though it might be his last. But here's the detail almost nobody mentions. The Hagakure was written by a man living in peacetime, reflecting on an era of war that had already ended. It wasn't a battlefield manual. It was a psychological framework for men who had no more battles to fight, but still needed a way to feel meaning in their discipline. That distinction matters enormously because it reveals the true engine behind the samurai mindset. It wasn't really about death at all. It was about control. Psychologists today study something called terror management, the theory that a huge amount of human behavior is quietly driven by our attempt to manage the anxiety of knowing we will die. Most people manage that fear by avoiding the thought entirely. The samurai mindset did the opposite. It confronted the fear directly, over and over, until repeated exposure dulled its power. If you rehearse your own death in your mind every single day, the theory goes, it stops being a source of paralyzing anxiety and starts becoming just another fact, like the weather. That psychological reframing is why samurai accounts so often describe calm in moments that should have produced panic. It wasn't that these men felt no fear. It's that they had spent years training their minds to not be controlled by it. This is where the deeper question finally surfaces, the one this entire documentary has been building toward. If discipline and death acceptance were the tools, what was the actual goal? What were they using this mindset to protect? The answer is a concept that sat at the very center of samurai identity. Honor, or more precisely, meiyo, a person's reputation and moral standing in the eyes of their community. In a warrior culture built on strict hierarchy and public loyalty, your honor wasn't a private feeling. It was a social currency. Lose it, and you didn't just feel shame, you could lose your position, your family's status, even your right to exist within your social world. This is why seppuku, ritual suicide, existed as a formal practice rather than a random act of despair. It was, in the samurai worldview, a way to take control of an ending that would otherwise be forced upon you by disgrace. Dying well on your own terms was framed as the ultimate act of dignity, proof that even in your final moment, you were not a victim of your fate, but the author of it. Modern psychology has a name for why this kind of framing is so powerful: perceived control. Humans tolerate almost anything better when they believe they have agency over it. Pain becomes bearable when you choose it. Death becomes less terrifying when you're the one deciding how it happens. The samurai mindset didn't eliminate fear. It restructured the entire relationship between the warrior and his own mortality, converting the most uncontrollable event in human life into the one moment where control mattered most. But loyalty was the second pillar, and it's just as psychologically loaded as death. Samurai owed absolute loyalty to their daimyo, their feudal lord, a relationship historians describe using the Japanese concept of jiri, a sense of duty and obligation so deep it could override personal desire, family ties, and even self-preservation. This wasn't blind obedience born from ignorance. It was a carefully constructed social contract. In exchange for land, protection, and status, A samurai gave his lord total loyalty, even to the point of death. And crucially, this loyalty was public. It was performed, witnessed, and judged by peers. In a culture where honor was social currency, loyalty became the clearest way to prove your worth wasn't just claimed, it was demonstrated. Here's the psychological trap hidden inside that system, and it's one worth sitting with. When your entire sense of self-worth depends on how others perceive your loyalty and honor, you become extremely resistant to questioning the people or systems you're loyal to, even when they're wrong. Historians note that this same code, when weaponized by later political movements centuries after the samurai class had technically ended, could be twisted into justifying extreme obedience and self-sacrifice for causes that had little to do with personal honor at all. A mindset built to give warriors psychological strength could also, in the wrong hands, be used to demand blind compliance. That's not a flaw unique to Bushido. It's a pattern that shows up whenever a society builds identity around unquestioning duty. The code itself was never inherently good or bad. It was a tool. And like any powerful psychological tool, its impact depended entirely on who was holding it and why. So where does that leave the mindset today? The discipline, the death acceptance, the honor, the loyalty. Did it disappear when the samurai class was formally abolished in 1876? When Japan modernized its military and stripped samurai of their exclusive right to bear arms? Not quite. What disappeared was the legal class. What survived was the psychology. Concepts drawn from the samurai code quietly seeped into Japanese business culture, into martial arts practiced worldwide, into ideas about discipline and self-mastery that show up in leadership seminars and personal development books that have nothing to do with Japan at all. When people today talk about showing up every day, about controlling what you can control, about facing hard truths without flinching, they are, often without realizing it, echoing a mindset first built by warriors trying to survive their own obsolescence 300 years ago. And that's really the final answer to the mystery this documentary opened with. Why would a man kneel calmly and accept death as a victory? Because centuries of psychological training had convinced him that the only thing truly his to control was not whether he lived or died, but how. That single reframe, repeated across generations, samurai households, and formalized texts, built one of the most disciplined mindsets in human history. Not because these men had no fear, but because they had trained themselves to make peace with the one thing every human being spends their life running from. The samurai are gone. The mindset they built is not. It lives on quietly in every person who has ever decided that how they face a difficult moment matters more than whether they can avoid it. Proof that the most powerful weapon a warrior culture ever built wasn't made of steel at all. It was made of thought.